how did Imam Maturidi explain God's wisdom, and is it central to his theology, and if so, why?
Yeah, I think it's a very distinctive element of his theology, often compared with other schools of thought, and also even with later people in his tradition who, to some extent, start to downplay it. For al-Maturidi, what he thinks is that we must understand God as wise, and this hikmah for him is not just the same as saying that God has knowledge. Every Muslim theologian will, I mean, with very few exceptions perhaps, will say God has knowledge. God has, whether it's understood as an attribute or, just a sort of an action of God. If you're Mu'tazili, they don't accept the idea of distinctive attributes. But the Ash'aris, for example, don't have this idea of wisdom. And I think what's important about wisdom is it's not just what God knows. God knows everything. It's not this omniscience of knowing everything. It's for al-Maturidi, it's a kind of purpose behind how God creates the world, a kind of deeper purpose, but yet it's not kind of an arbitrary will that God just wants it one way. It's a kind of it's a purpose that we can, to some extent, to some small extent, sometimes we can kind of see that purpose. So that purpose connects to our experience of the world. This is, in fact, one of the reasons why I call the book Transcendent God, Rational World. The world itself has this kind of rationality to it, has this understandability, and it's not just an arbitrary feature of the world. It's in a sense a necessary, a metaphysically necessary feature of the world. What I mean by that is that God's wisdom is a sort of eternal aspect of his being, of his nature, and so it's, God will never act against his wisdom. And so if we know something about, if we can use indications in the world to tell us something about God's wisdom, it will actually give us reliable information, not just on how the world has to be, but also how God is and how God acts. And so it gives us an access to understanding something about God. Now, this is a challenging notion, and we have to say that, ultimately we can't comprehend God's wisdom. Ultimately, we can't explain it with anything further. It just is. The buck stops at God's wisdom, at his attribute of wisdom. But what I think this concept allows al-Maturidi to do is to have some of the advantages that are sometimes felt from the Mu'tazili school of thought, in terms of giving the human beings being able to have knowledge of the world, to be able to understand that God won't do certain things, and I say to also to ground, some elements of, aspects of God we understand, that God will speak truthfully to us, that God will, that there's something that is deeply purposeful and meaningful in his creation of the world and in our place for it, that grounds things like ethics and what is right and wrong in the world, that there are genuine wrongs and genuine rights, and it's not just an arbitrary fiat of God, but it's actually grounded in this attribute of wisdom. But at the same time, what it doesn't do is it doesn't put a constraint that's external to God on God. The world does not constrain God, because this is all grounded in God's own nature, God's own attribute of being wise. And so it doesn't get into a problem of saying, well, there's certain things that God can't do because God is no longer fully powerful, or something like this. It doesn't make human beings independent of God, but it puts all of that within the divine majesty. So I think that al-Maturidi, with his concept of wisdom, he's actually able to, and I try to do this in the book to some extent, and it comes up a little bit in my previous book, I think it does actually allow a kind of way to solve certain theological problems that have really plagued Islamic history, and even generally come up as theological questions. I think this concept of his attribute of wisdom is actually a very powerful understanding of theological understanding that allows us to kind of rationally understand certain concepts, even things sometimes to do with free will and fate. These kind of big questions can kind of sometimes come down to our understanding of the divine wisdom. So it is an important element, and for various reasons, I sort of show how it became underplayed, and later Maturidis, they sometimes mention it, but it starts to be discussed not in the area of the divine attributes, but it starts being discussed with relation to prophecy, which is a much later part of Kalam books, and it's showing a kind of downgrading of its status, and then the understanding of it becomes quite attenuated in times, and it's not what it was with Maturidi himself. So I think that.
What do you think that happened? Like the Quran mentions, Alim and Hakim 35 times together. Very, very. There's a lot of emphasis in the Quran. Probably that's what's driven Imam Maturidi to also go. It's very interesting, fascinating that he took it as an attribute, one of the essential attributes. We now have 8 where knowledge, ilm is recognized as an attribute, but Hakim is not there. What happened? Like, was it, you think, relegated?
I think it's a very interesting question. My own thinking about this, it seems to have been there. Even there's I think a student of Al-Maturidi, but he lives fairly close, just after him, called Abu Salama al-Samarkandi. He's in Samarkand as well, slightly later in the 4th, 10th century, and he is also in his book also writing of hikmah as an attribute. But by the time of like the kind of the next century on, as the kind of Maturidi type of views start to spread beyond Samarkand to places like Bukhara, and in this kind of wider Transoxania region, there's an encounter with Ash'ari thought, and Ash'arism doesn't have this concept, and they argue, there's just God just has knowledge. This is, and if you mean either you mean knowledge, or you mean if you're talking about like the perfection of creation or something, then maybe you mean the way that God creates things. Then for Maturidis, that would be this idea of takwin, this attribute of creation, and it kind of just got explained as one or the other. I think under pressure, probably from debates with Ash'aris, they just decided, for whatever reasons, that they could explain it either through knowledge or through they basically had to make a stand on some points to distinguish themselves from Ash'arism, and the takwin debate was more central to their identity, and that was kept. This idea of God's creative action, all of God's actions got funneled into this one attribute. For Al-Maturidi, he talks about all of God's actions as eternal, and he doesn't see them all necessarily being identical with takwin. So, for example, for Al-Maturidi, God's speech is an action, right? So what I think's happening, to put it in a nutshell, is that the Maturidis are making a stand on this other attribute of takwin, and hikmah, is not in common use. And it just seems difficult to defend it for what, the exact details of that is hard to tell, but they seem to sort of progressively shift it down and to not feel the need to make it a central part of their understandings. And I think this is probably influenced from the.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. But do you think that that should be revived within the Maturidi tradition, or in general Islamic theology? Because when I was growing up, especially at the university, I had a lot of questions in my mind, and this wisdom was a savior to one's faith, and I use it a lot when I speak to young people these days who have doubts about religion. So we have a questioning mind, and we have a lot of knowledge of the world. When you watch David Attenborough's documentaries, you see those purposes come out. So do you think there is a greater place in our time for wisdom?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, my whole approach with the book is to kind of go back to Al-Maturidi, look in detail at his system, try to understand it. It's challenging. I mean, his book is hard, and there's sometimes multiple interpretations, but take those ideas and then see what the tradition can kind of add to it. And later figures, and trace some of that, and then look at to contemporary matters. And one of the arguments that I make in the in the book is that we should revive this concept of hikmah. And it's something that's actually been noted in the wider discussion of philosophical theology, that it is an important attribute, but it's very hard to say a lot about it, because it's kind of got a bit of a mysterious element to it, because ultimately God's wisdom is not something that we can fully comprehend. So what I argue in the book is that, based on what Maturidi says in some places, is that I associate this concept with what I call metaphysical necessity, which might sound like very above heads, but basically there's this idea of logical necessity, right? So if something is logically necessary, we can't oppose that without getting into contradiction. We must think this thing, right? So we can think of lots of examples of like 2 + 2 is 4, or the various kind of things that are logically essential. And this is often used. This is used by Asharis as well. This famous thing about can God create us? He can't lift, and these kind of puzzles. They're resolved by saying that these are incoherent. They're logically incoherent notions, right? But what I'm saying for this for Maturidi is there's this further, we could say, metaphysical necessity. What this is saying is there's some things that we can conceive that God could do those things, but by virtue of his wisdom, he never ever will. And so there's a famous example of, like, would he put his prophets into the hellfire? This is a famous Maturidi example. Maturidi say, logically, there's no logical contradiction. God can place any person into the hellfire, but from his wisdom, we know for certain that he never ever will. He won't. He does not, and it's necessary that he does not. And we can say that without worry, because we're grounding that in this attribute of wisdom. So I think it's a very powerful concept, and I try to extend it a little bit further to other elements of the kind of picture as I through the book. You can see that, but it's a tricky notion, and it needs further thought and development, because anything that's been downplayed hasn't been developed and used enough. It needs time, and it needs space, and there's a lot of work to get it to be a mainstream concept. But personally, I think it should be revived.
The attribute of takwin, the creative action, as you kind of translated in your book. Why is that so central to Maturidi's, Imam Maturidi? Why did they insist on that attribute so much?
Okay, so this obviously all Muslim theologians would argue that or say that God creates the world, and so they want to explain what is it about God's attributes that mean that the world God creates the world. And so the attribute of takwin, or I translated it as creative action. Sometimes we're seeing in the literature existentiation and things like this, but I found that a bit wordy, so I tried to make it more clear that it was just creative action. But in any case, what they felt, this was the attribute that gives this link. So God has power. For Maturidi's, God has power over the world. This means that he is able to create whatever he wants. He's got the power to do so, and he's got a will, which would be the decision to create. But there still needs to be an action that is the actual creating of the world, because there are things that God has power over that he doesn't actually create. So this action is the action of creation. And so what Maturidi say is all of God's actions, as I've said, are eternal. If God speaks, it's eternal. If God creates, it's eternal. Everything that God does, if God is pleased with someone or displeased, this is his eternal action. Even if the effects of the action happen in time, because obviously all creation happens in time by definition. So the Imam Maturidi and the later Maturidis, they felt that they must make a stand on this action to say that this is an element of the divine nature, and as one of God's actions, it has to be eternal. This is what it means for God to create the world, is to have this action. Asharis, for example, really said that there is just God with his power and his will, and what he wills, that he creates that, and then that is the creation. And there really isn't a strong distinction between the created thing and creation. All that creation is is that there, that we can understand. It's just a concept that we have that God has made this appear. So God's made, I don't know, a cup appear in my room. He's created that. All that it means for God to create that is that there is this cup, and it links back to his attributes of he's got a power to do it and a will to do it. But what the Maturidi said is, well, where's his actual action of actually creating that cup? He has to. We have to say that he is actually creating the actual cup. So this, because of their position on the divine actions and their eternality, they include it, and it was always an important marker of sort of Maturidi identity versus the Asharis. Even in the later times when the two schools came quite close together, in many ways, they always held this distinction. Sometimes more contemporary scholars or later scholars try to say it's kind of just a verbal difference between the two schools. And this was normally done in the interest of kind of bringing the Sunnism together. So it's a kind of political or identity project. But in terms of the theological systems, I think that there is a meaningful distinction here, and there always has been. And it's a way of doing theology, a way of thinking about what is most coherent. Maturidis, they make power only about potential. Like, what does God have power over? It's the potential to create, we could say. Even things he doesn't create, he's still got the power over. So the cup that I don't know, the other type of cup that he didn't create, right? And he has power over that too. He could have done it. That's how Maturidi see it. For Asharis, power includes actually making it happen. So that's why some considered it to be a verbal disagreement. But for the Maturidis, there was this important distinction of God's action has to be affirmed. So this is kind of some of the debate, and there's other elements to it and other controversies that may come up. And for those who are interested, I've got a chapter on it in the book, chapter 6. So you can hopefully read that and understand the sort of the deeper discussion there.